Apple buying advice, and a new website with Josh Centers. This is MacVoices. This edition of MacVoices is supported by our Patreon patrons. Help support MacVoices and gain access to the MacVoices Slack and MacVoices After Dark at patreon.com/MacVoices. Welcome to MacVoices. This is the talk of the Apple community, and I'm Chuck Joyner. Folks, you know him as managing editor for TidBITS, but did you know that he's a webmaster too of his own site? Josh Centers is back. Josh, it's great to see you.
Hey, thanks for having me, Chuck.
So, as I said, we know you as the managing editor of TidBITS. What are you doing publishing a website?
Well, so I find myself constantly fielding questions about Apple products. I hear from people, not quite every day, but several times a week, asking me, is now a good time to buy an iPhone? Which one should I buy? Should I buy this Mac, etc.? And I hear that, I get it from TidBITS readers, I get it from Take Control readers, I get it from friends, family, sometimes people I haven't heard from in 2 decades. I graduated high school in 2001, and sometimes some of those folks will message me out of the blue after I haven't talked to them in over 20 years, and they want to ask me about a phone. And so I kind of got tired of answering the questions, and so I launched this website to try to provide just very quick answers for the non-technical. Like what I want a Mac desktop, I want an iPhone, I want an iPad. Should I buy one now? And which one should I buy? And so I just offer really quick recommendations. And in fact, if you go to the front page, if you go to applebuyingadvice.com, you can scroll down and I have all the top picks just right there. And you can click one of the buttons and buy it right away. And if you don't like that, I have several guides I've written, and I do update those as new products come out and things are updated. And you can read about some different options, and you get my opinion on it. It's no one else's opinion; it's just my opinion. You're free to accept that or reject it. So some people do one of each. But it's basically like all of my opinions on Apple products on one convenient website.
So I have to tell you, I'm jealous, and I bet there are about 50 other people I know that are jealous of you coming up with this idea, because we all field those questions. And every time there are new Macs that come out, there are articles on almost every website. Is it time to buy? Is it not time to buy? Should you buy this? Should you buy that? Which one should you buy? And we that's great, right then, but then it falls off, and then it has to be rewritten or updated later. And to dedicate a whole website to it, and to make it understandable and easy for people who are not as deep into it as we are, is just brilliant. And so, congratulations. I'm just sorry that I didn't think of it.
Well, thank you. I don't know how it'll do as a commercial venture. But what's funny is I'm probably answering more questions now than I ever have, because now I have the Apple buying advice people contacting me and asking specific things, especially after the last Apple event we just had recently. I had a lot of heartbroken owners of 27-inch iMacs asking, what do I buy? And so I had to put out, we do have a newsletter too, and it's extremely low volume because I hate email, both sending and receiving. So I try not to bother people unless I have something important to say. And, I just had to tell people, I gave an overview of what was updated, and I just had to say, well, I'm going to have to chew on this a bit. As we say in the South, I'm going to have to think on it, because that really, it gave me a conundrum, because I'm a huge 27-inch iMac guy. I'm on a 27-inch iMac right now, and it's been the best in terms of price performance for so long. But right now, my recommendations, my basic recommendations haven't really changed, because I think the 27-inch iMac, more of a semi-pro machine, if that makes any sense. My top desktop pick right now is the 24-inch iMac, and Adam Engst actually recently did some analysis comparing the 27-inch iMac against various pairings of the Studio display and also the 24-inch iMac. And in terms of value, the 24-inch iMac is really hard to beat. It's a bargain of a machine considering everything you get, and you sacrifice just a little bit of screen space. But I was still pretty confident in my basic recommendation there. And for a laptop, I'm still recommending the MacBook Air with upgraded storage to most people. I do almost always recommend more storage and or more RAM out of the box, because you can never really have enough. And one of the biggest problems I see with Apple users who aren't in the know is that they will buy the cheapest they'll buy the cheapest thing in a lineup, and then it's a couple of years later and they don't have any storage. Even if they barely use the device, the OS updates have taken everything up, or a lot of apps balloon, and then they have a big problem on their hands, and they're forced to make some tough decisions. I try to help people avoid that. Thankfully, I'm so glad that Apple made the baseline storage on the iPhone 13 128 gigabytes, because that's hopefully going to solve a lot of problems for people.
Yeah, agreed. I think it's interesting, Josh, and I'm curious to get your take on it. The M1 machines are just ungodly powerful. I agree with you on the RAM. That's one place that you can choke a little bit, but I think you're right. The iMac 27 is a semi-professional machine, but I feel like these M1 iMacs border somewhere, with the exception of the screen real estate, they play in that same realm because they are so powerful. In fact, in a lot of cases, I think a lot of people I know are probably better off with an iPad. I mean, I'm sorry, it's just the way it is, because they look up things on the web, they answer email, and they may play a few word games.
Mm-hmm. I cover that in both the Mac and iPad guides. I have a little section called Mac versus iPad, or iPad versus Mac. And I kind of give an analysis. I kind of give my opinion there. Me personally, I would go insane if an iPad were my main machine. And what most of what I do isn't that complex. I write things in Google Docs. I import things into WordPress through a web browser. I do some light image editing. I'm not doing, I'm a professional Apple user, but I'm not doing, hardcore workflows and stuff, usually. But I think I think it really depends on your use case. My mom, I recommended a base model iPad to her. Actually, I just bought her one a few years ago, and she still loves it. It's her favorite computer ever. She takes it everywhere. She does everything on it, and it gives her no trouble, and it does everything she needs, and she totally loves it. And I think, you really have to evaluate for yourself, for someone you're recommending. You really have to identify their needs and their technical aptitude. If their needs are minimal, like web browsing, email, etc., and they're the sort of person who might screw something up on their computer, they might install some malware, then I think they're a perfect candidate for an iPad as a main device. If they're making money in any capacity with their machine, they're a little more technical, they'll probably be happier with a Mac. But it's really interesting now, because you see that same M1 chip all the way from the iPad Air, all the way to like the 24-inch iMac, and in variations of that same M1 chip in more professional level machines. So it's a really versatile chip. It's really kind of interesting how Apple is almost standardized on it, which really makes my recommendations very simple, because I can compare apples to apples, in terms of performance for a lot of things. But yeah, like that in terms of the Mac versus iPad split, like I that's sort of my split. If you're if you have really simple needs, I think an iPad is the way to go. And if if you get to the territory, you're juggling a lot of windows, you're copying things between different windows. That's the iPad's real Achilles heel is the windowing system. It's improved a great deal. But yeah, if you start getting into things like that, you're like using a lot of spreadsheets, things like that. I think the Mac's the way to go.
No, I agree, and I love your approach of technical expertise and use case, because that's always the first thing that I think as a buyer or as an advice giver, okay, what are you going to do with this? What do you want to do with this? And then you can start addressing it intelligently, because I speak for you and me too. We all want to see ourselves as professionals of some kind, and so therefore we need a professional machine. Yeah, okay. I mean, depending on what you're doing, you very well likely may need a professional machine. But on the other hand, you may not, and you may just be wasting money to say that you have it. So, if that's what you want to do, hey, I'm an Apple stockholder, fine. Go, have at it. But if not, then buy something that really fits you.
Adam Engst had a good article on TidBITS recently talking about how he wishes Apple would make professional machines for pros that aren't, video editors or coders, because that's who they always seem to aim professional machines at. He gave the example of, it's funny, he published this the day before the Mac Studio was introduced, which actually addressed a few of his things. But he mentioned, how about an iMac where I can actually adjust the height of the screen so I don't have to crane my neck when I'm using it. So what's funny, for my line of work, I'm a writer primarily. I do some image processing. I don't need just a ton of horsepower. I do need a lot of RAM, and I do need a lot of storage. Those are my two main things. I think for most people, processors have been fine for years. Even, with the performance gains you get from going from Intel to Apple Silicon, I don't think most people even notice or care about that. I do think what they care about is having a laptop that doesn't burn your legs or other body parts when you're using it. That's nice. But in terms of process, and that's why I don't. For most people, I don't recommend faster processors. No, I mean, again, they're all kind of standard M1s at this point, so it'd be pointless anyway. But for most people, I don't think that they need that. I think they just need a processor. And then, and the other interesting thing is too, I always recommend more RAM, but the M1, because the RAM is built into the chip, the processing, like the swapping, is so much faster than it was on Intel machines. And so in a lot of cases, you can get away with less RAM than you could on Intel. For instance, this iMac has 40 gigabytes, which still seems astronomical to me, especially given what I do for a living. But I use that RAM, because programs are such RAM hogs. But now I'm wondering if I moved to like an 8 gigabyte M1, I'm wondering if there may be similar performance there just due to the better efficiency.
I agree. And we're all, I think, having to get used to this new world that we maybe don't need to max out the RAM. Although when I bought my 16-inch M1 Pro, M1 Max, I maxed out the RAM. Now, I'm happy to report that as a result, the fans never run, literally the fans never run, and I don't find that I get out of memory messages. So, is that a function of the M1, or is it a function of the fact that I stacked up the RAM? I personally think it's a function of the M1 and the architecture, because even on my previously maxed out MacBook Pros, 2019, with all the RAM I could put in there, the fans were ready for takeoff at any minute, and I was getting out of memory messages. So.
Yeah, and back to your original point. So I got a little rambly there. Back to your original point about the pro machines, not necessarily being for all pros. I don't really use any pro machines, or if I bought one, it probably won't be a quote unquote pro machine. Like my 27-inch iMac is my main machine. I do have an iPhone 11 Pro, and the only reason I even have Pro is because I like the telephoto lens. But it's an old iPhone at this point. But I also don't see. I'm kind of cheap. I don't see a ton of benefit to upgrading right now. The iPhone's been pretty stable for a few years. My iPad, I bought a new iPad recently. I just got the base model iPad, which is what I recommend in Apple buying advice, because it does just about everything you need from an iPad, but it's very cheap. And in my book, why spend a lot of money on an iPad you'll want to replace in a couple of years when you can buy a cheap one every year, and typically has a pretty up-to-date processor. It gets all the professional features eventually. I like the value products in the Apple lineup. I do have a MacBook Pro, but it's from 2016, so I'm not sure that counts as Pro anymore. I could probably buy a MacBook Air and have much better performance overall. But and that's sort of the same attitude I take with my recommendations. I don't want people to have to spend more money than they have to. I also don't want them to get an inferior product. There is a sweet spot. There's always a sweet spot in these tech buying decisions, and I do try to help people find that.
Yeah. Josh, I wouldn't normally, since I know that the buying guide is for Apple products, I wouldn't normally ask this, but given that the 27-inch iMac has apparently been discontinued, or at least for the moment, it's not in the line, and the Mac Mini is, are you making any recommendations for monitors or anything like that, peripherals to go with the Mac Mini that might help it fit into that spot left by the iMac 27-inch?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I haven't quite updated the guides for the latest products yet, since they aren't technically out. And sort of that my philosophy there is, if you're a big enough Apple person that you're on top of this stuff, and you want something, you probably already pre-ordered it from Apple. You don't really need me. But I do think, in terms of my recommendation that I will publish, I probably will not recommend a third-party display. And I say that even as someone, I have an LG monitor here that's actually quite good. It's a 4K instead of a 5K. It's good. It's not as good as an Apple display. And honestly, apparently they don't even make it anymore. I bought it like at the end of last year, and then they discontinued it like 2 months later. I can't keep track of that stuff. Now, I have recommended a successor model to people, but then I have to say, like, I haven't used this. I cannot vouch for its quality. And sometimes, a company may come out with a good product one year and then follow up with another one that's terrible. And I don't want to recommend junk to people. So honestly, for in terms of monitors, in terms of displays, I will. And part of the reason I'm waiting too is I want to wait for reviews. I want to see what people say about the studio display. Our friend Julio Ojeda Zapata, he's getting a review unit. He's going to check it out for TidBITS, and I want his take on it, because it's a $1,600 monitor, and I'm sure it'll be good. I have no doubt it'll be good, but is it going to be worth $1,600? And that remains to be seen. But if I do recommend an external display, it'll be the Apple one, just because you're not going to find another display on the market that's going to look as good as that 27-inch iMac display. You're just not, especially with the kind of integration Apple will have. And if I recommend anything else, you're going to be disappointed. You just are. The main reason most of us bought that 27-inch iMac is for that 27-inch screen, that big, beautiful screen that I'm staring at right now. And, this LG I have, this 27-inch, also quite good, but not quite as sharp. The colors aren't quite as good. Cost a lot less than that $1,600 monitor. But, I don't want to give people the wrong impression. I don't want people to think that, I can buy this $400 LG monitor, or, and I can't recommend that 5K display from LG. It's several years old now. And honestly, when I looked at it in an Apple store, it didn't look that great to me. It looked kind of, I don't know, grainy, and it didn't look like it was built that well. I've heard a lot of people having trouble with them. And it was a pretty expensive monitor too. So again, I don't want to recommend an expensive monitor that's outdated and may not be supported well. So yeah, so that's kind of the boat I'm stuck in. So in terms of displays, I'm recommending either a 24-inch iMac, or I'm going to recommend the studio display. And I think those are probably the best recommendations I can make, especially for people missing the 27-inch iMac.
Yeah. I, none of us have seen the studio display yet, but Apple, when they were making displays, had a great reputation for displays, and of course, the iMac displays are the iMac displays. They're absolutely gorgeous.
Mm.
So I don't think you're wrong there. I probably would not be doing my job if I didn't, though, ask you about the studio, the Mac Studio. Since
Okay.
it's hot, it's new. I just talked to some
Mhm.
folks this morning, and a bunch of them have already ordered them. With all due respect to those people, I don't think they begin to start to have the need for a Mac Studio, but they want one, and so that's fine. Go for it. But what would you say to somebody if they walked up to you and said, "I'm going to buy, or I'm thinking about buying a Mac Studio"?
I'll ask them if they're interested in donating to Apple buying advice, because they apparently have a lot of extra money to burn. um, the Mac Studio is a really interesting product, and it's interesting for a lot of reasons. One, of course, being that it has effectively killed the 27-inch iMac, which is itself very interesting. But it's also an answer. Look, for a long time, look, this is what Apple fans asked for. They wanted a mid-range standalone box that was more powerful than a Mac Mini, more modular. Which, I mean, the Mac Studio is modular in terms of Apple's point of view, right? It has more than one port, and there are some in the front. That's Apple's definition of modular. And for a long time, owners of the 27-inch iMac just said, "Oh man, I wish I could separate this display and then have a separate box, and then I could update the box." Now you can. It's going to cost you more than before. Adam ran the numbers on that. It's just going to cost you more. I mean, now you can get to a point where it's very similar to a 27-inch iMac price, and in the long run, if you keep this display for a decade or so, which isn't unreasonable, then it'll probably save you a lot of money. I think it'll save TidBITS money in the long run. But in terms of the Mac Studio, honestly, I'm not entirely sure who it's for. I think what's really, and the reason it makes it so difficult is Apple did mention that there would be one more Mac, and they mentioned the Mac Pro is still coming. So if you're someone who works in video, if you're someone who works as a developer, now I know a lot of those people have already bought a Mac Studio, and I'm sure they'll have no problem selling them if they need to. But if you're one of those people that owns a Mac Pro already, and you're probably kind of furious about it, but you know if you're one of those people, you have to ask yourself, "Oh, do I want the Mac Studio now, or when's this Mac Pro coming out?" It's a little unfair. It was a little unfair of Apple to do that to people, right? Like, because now they have this dilemma on their hands. They have to really think about this. Um, and so, yeah, I'm not entirely sure who I recommend the Apple Studio for right now. It's definitely, I think, going to be a more powerful machine than the Mac Mini. Um, so, I guess I might recommend it for someone who just their needs aren't satisfied by the current lineup and they cannot wait for a Mac Pro. I'm not entirely sure who that is. My guess is, and this is part of why I haven't thought about it too much for Apple buying advice, is if you're that person, you already know. And it's funny, I get a lot of messages from people who've read Apple buying advice and like, "Oh, I don't agree with your recommendation." Like I had one guy tell me, like, "Well, I love my Mac Mini," which, I'm not against Mac Mini. I'm actually not against any Apple product right now, I don't think. Just some things I would recommend more than others. But he's like, "I use my Mac Mini with a 34-inch screen." I'm like, "That's great. That's not most people. Most people do not own a 34-inch screen." There's nothing wrong with that. Like that's also, I'm not in a big hurry to add something about the Mac Studio. And when I do add something, I'll probably say you don't need this, because the students writing term papers in college, or are not going to need it. People doing their taxes help them on their in Excel. They're not going to need a Mac Studio. I figure Mac Studio is a product that if you know you need it and you know you have the cash for it, you've probably already pre-ordered it. And last I saw, those pre-orders are pretty far out now. So you might be lucky to get one by the summertime. So Apple clearly has a hit, and the people who want them clearly know who they are.
Today's edition of MacVoices is supported by our Patreon sponsors. Support MacVoices at any level and gain access to the MacVoices Slack, where you can interact with the MacVoices live crew, participate in our discussions, and get your questions answered. You also get access to MacVoices After Dark, the uncensored, unscripted, and always enjoyable discussions before and after the MacVoices live show. Sign up at patreon.com/MacVoices, and thanks for supporting MacVoices. I think I might disagree with you just a little bit on the Mac Pro. I'm glad Apple teased it, just because then nobody can say, well, we weren't sure. So we bought it back to the Studio, and now we really found out we need a Mac Pro. So we see the performance of the Studio, and you got to believe that the performance of the Pro is going to be, several levels above that. So now you can either continue to wait, or you can buy something interim, and as you said, then resell it, or have it as a secondary backup, or just a second pretty heavy-duty production machine. But I'm glad they did that. I think the Studio, though, is really interesting that you can basically get it almost like the iMac and the iMac Pro. You can get it with the M1 chip and have it be a little more like the iMac, or you can get it with the M1 Ultra and now have it be a whole lot more like the iMac Pro. Once you pair it with a monitor of some kind, whether it's the Apple Studio display or something else. So I think that it's interesting that they kind of filled with one form factor and only a chip change. Well, I guess technically, and a couple extra Thunderbolt ports as opposed to USB-C ports. But they kind of filled two different niches there with one box. You just have to decide how much money you want and what really makes sense for you.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll be curious to see what the stress tests on the Mac Studio look like and what the real world performance is. I do think for most people, I do agree with you. There is a certain liability thing with Apple saying, yeah, there's a Mac Pro on the way, like that way people can't get mad if they buy the Mac Studio now. At least they know what they're getting into. But yeah, I do think it's interesting. For most people, though, the M1 is fine, and it looks like the M1 has some life in it yet, which is why I'm still comfortable recommending it, even after a couple of years. But yeah, and it's really interesting how you have this one chip and all these different form factors. Do you want a tablet? Do you want a bigger tablet? Do you want a standalone computing box? Do you want a laptop? Do you want a laptop with a fan? It's like it's the same computer, just in different boxes, and that's really interesting. There's no longer the desktop chip and the mobile chip, and things are so different. It's the exact same computer, just packed. It's sort of like the Jim Gaffigan joke about being the waiter at a Mexican restaurant, and everyone asks, like, okay, what are tacos? Oh, well, it's a tortilla with meat, beans, and rice. Like, oh, what are nachos? Oh, those are tortillas with meat, beans, and rice. Like it's all basically the same stuff, just configured in a way that suits you better, which is really interesting. Yeah. So, but in terms of Apple buying advice, yeah, I think M1's fine for now. I'm curious if we'll see M2 this year. Lots of talk about that, but it doesn't look like Apple's done with M1. They just released M1 Ultra. I mean, how many more M1s are there? We've already had M1, M1 Max, M1 Ultra. What's the Mac Pro going to have? M1 Super Giga Ultra. It's going to be like 4 chips glued together.
Yeah, my bet is on M1 Hyper.
M1 Hyper.
Yep, M1 Hyper. Yep, which
M1
would
Plus.
be. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, and let's not forget that we have 3 flavors of the M1. Before you get the whole way up to the Ultra. So it's an interesting diverse line, and it seems like there's a little something for everybody at a lot of different price points, and that can be I know Apple in the past has been confused about having too many SKUs, and there's an argument right now, I think, that could be made that they have too many right now. But on the other hand, they also are offering an awful lot of versatility in choice and not having all those models and all that inventory, sitting around.
Mhm.
It's just the guts that is making the difference. And at the end of the day, that's where the real difference should be made, not in which way the metal gets bent or plastic gets twisted.
Yeah, I do think there are some places where Apple could introduce some clarity to the lineup. For instance, I find the MacBook Pro situation confusing. I don't know why there's a 13-inch and then a 14-inch at the same time. That, like, I'm not sure what the point of that is. I'm sure there's some point. Um, I do find it a little frustrating the new SE, which I do think is a great value, but it still has the home button when nothing else does, and so it just adds confusion to the whole lineup. I'm sure there's a good argument for keeping that around. I've read a few, but um, yeah, there's just a few little places like the iPad lineup I find kind of confusing. I'm not quite sure sometimes why you would choose an iPad Air versus an iPad Pro, especially now that they both have M1. And really, for most people at this point, I would recommend the Air over the Pro because you get the same hardware for less money. Now, of course, the other shoe to drop is whatever Apple does with the iPad Pro. But I do think there are a few places where they can add some more clarity. But I think generally, so like Steve Jobs famously did the four square grid, right, where it's like professional, desktop. I would say that's Mac Studio clearly. Uh, you know, Amateur, is that the right word I'm going for? Like the consumer, yeah, consumer desktop. Be either Mac Mini or iMac. There's a little confusion there. Uh, Professional laptop be one of the MacBooks Pro, which there is a little confusion there, as I mentioned, and then you have the MacBook Air as the consumer laptop. I do think the upcoming Mac Pro also confuses that because okay, which one's the professional desktop? There's a little bit of confusion, but it could be
Yeah.
Apple certainly had worse lineups.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And I like the fact that there's a lot of choice, just depending on how high up the pecking order you want to buy into, because that's what it amounts to, is the dollars. And so instead of saying, well, you can only get the M. Well, I guess come to think of it, right now you can only get the M1, the variation on the M1 in the MacBook Pros. That's not in the desktop yet, right now, anyway.
Mhm.
So, are you touching on HomePods and anything like that, or is this primarily phones, tablets, and Macs?
I still need to write an Apple TV guide. I do recommend on the front page. I recommend, the 4K 32 gigabyte, or I recommend just a Roku Express 4K. Because honestly, most of my viewing is done through a Roku TV now. Glenn Fleischman reviewed this Roku Express for TidBITS recently and really liked it. And I've heard from some of the people who took my recommendation and they really like it. So, like part of me is like, don't even bother with an Apple TV. There's no point. You can save a lot of money going with something else that honestly probably works better for most people. I'm not quite sure how to say that on an Apple focused site. In terms of the HomePod, Adam Engst has chided me a bit for not having a HomePod guide. And originally, so I do have an earbud guide, like slash headphone guide. I thought about throwing the HomePod in there somewhere, but it's not quite the same category. And it's also one of those places where there's not a lot of choice. Like if you want a HomePod, if you want the Apple speaker, it's there. It's just the one. It's not like you're having to decide between multiple options. I do think the HomePod Mini is a good device. I want to fit it in somewhere. I just haven't found a place that makes the most sense to me yet. And one of my big goals with Apple buying advice is keeping it as clean and logical as possible. It's a lot of white space. It's a very clean site. I actually really just optimize the heck out of it to maximize or minimize the load times and make it as fast as I possibly could. I always keep that in mind before I add anything else to the site, before I add any potential clutter. I really want to make sure I'm putting it, I'm putting it something that's really going to add value.
I love the fact that you've taken this on. I love the fact that you've designed it the way you have. But I especially respect the way that you're saying, I'm not quite sure about this and I haven't gotten to that yet, because it shows that instead of just slapping things up, you're really trying to think about them and think about them on a longer term basis instead of just trying to, I've got this site and click through and, buy something from it or look at the ads or whatever. And so, I hope it's something that you do keep up and can keep up and it's around for a long time. And I still wish I'd thought of it first. So what else is going on with you and TidBITS? Anything or any of your other endeavors that are noteworthy?
Oh, well, I don't know what's worth talking about here. I have several endeavors in various fields. I've been pretty entrepreneurial in 2022. Right now for TidBITS, I'm working on documenting universal control, which is a really interesting feature. I don't quite know what to do with it yet. Like, it's one of those things I play with. I'm like, that's neat. That's kind of mind blowing. I don't know what it like. It feels like it should change everything, but I'm not quite sure how it changes everything yet. I could see, maybe some of the TikTokers coming up with some really interesting uses for it. Now I do run. So I have a very unusual niche in the writing world. By day, I write about Apple. By night, I write about prepping and emergency preparedness. I do have if you're interested, I have a Substack dedicated to that. It's called Unprepared, and you can find it at unprepared.life. And we cover a wide range of topics. And I carry a similar sensibility from Apple buying advice because, so many prepping sites will, they try to get you to buy this really expensive survival food and, all this, what we call Gucci gear, like a $200 flashlight, this and that. And there's nothing wrong with that. But, I really want prepping to be for everybody, because everyone needs to be prepared for emergencies. If you go to ready.gov, the Biden administration will tell you the same thing. So it's not just, some crazy thing to say. And so I do things like I have one guide where I show people how to store a week of food and water for a family of three for well under $100. And I literally just bought some buckets and went to Dollar Tree, and my wife even made a silly little jingle. And then I also try to write things in a way that tries to calm people. Like, I had a lot of people freaking out with Vladimir Putin, and he was kind of hinting at using nuclear weapons, and so I had all these questions, and so I wrote it ended up being a 2-part guide. And what was funny is I think by the time I finished with it, no one cared anymore. But it takes time to write these things and and do a decent job. And so I do have guides, and these 2 guides are totally free. They are how to maximize your chance of survival if there is the unthinkable happens, if there is a nuclear attack. And that actually ended up being really controversial. Before the guides came out, I got attacked for saying I was going to write them. I actually meant to be on this show a couple of weeks ago, but to talk about Apple buying advice. I literally had like thousands and thousands of people in my Twitter saying awful things, including blue check journalists, and I even got featured in the New Republic. They're poking fun at me a bit, and which is funny because they got a lot of very basic facts wrong. Like, they couldn't even get the lyrics to our Dollar Tree jingle correct, which they could have literally copied and pasted them. I'm still laughing about that. So but it's all good, and actually the hate mob was very good for the publication. It picked up a lot of subscribers because these people would hate quote tweet me on Twitter, and then they would say, "Look at this idiot," and then their followers would say, "Oh, hey, that idiot's onto something," and they click it and subscribe. So anytime the hate mob wants to stop by and promote my work, I am more than happy to take a little abuse because they did me a big favor.
Okay, lessons in publicity from Josh Centers, which will be his next website on how to get followers by having them hate you. Well, Josh, thank you again. Congratulations on the site. I think it's a great addition to the Mac community. I think all of us should take a quick look at it and then tuck it away in our. Well, if anybody still uses bookmarks, but at least in our heads to hand out to friends and family members who come and ask us some of those things, because Josh has a much better handle on it than any of us do, because he's immersed in it all the time.
Yeah, so. Absolutely. Yeah. So next time you have a friend asking you this stuff, just say, go to applebuyingadvice.com.
Yep. We know the guy that runs it, and he's trustworthy. Josh, thank you so much. It's great to see you.
Yeah, thanks for having me here.
All right, keep your head down.
I'll try.
Folks, I'm Chuck Joyner. This is MacVoices. Hey, if you need advice, or if you just want to see what Josh says about maybe what your choices, the choices you've already made are, by all means, applebuyingadvice.com. Go check it out. Until the next time, and as always, thanks for watching. Visit MacVoices.com for show notes and to connect with Chuck on social media. Get involved in our Facebook group or like our Facebook page, and get more out of your Apple tech with MacVoices Magazine, free on Flipboard and on the web. And if you find value in it all, consider supporting us through either our Patreon campaign at patreon.com/MacVoices or by making a one-time donation via the PayPal link on our front page and in the show notes of each episode. You will join these fine people who help bring you MacVoices. Advertising handled by Backbeat Media at backbeatmedia.com. Bandwidth provided by CacheFly at cachefly.com.